Hello. Sometimes a person disappears. They vanish without a trace, leaving behind only emptiness and unanswered questions. But the story we're going to talk about today is different. It didn't just leave questions, it left a clue. A single item found in such a place and under such circumstances that it still baffles investigators and casts doubt on reality itself. June 1982. The Kaibab National Forest in Arizona is a vast area of pine forest, canyons, and plateaus. It is a wild, expansive, and largely uninhabited place. For the United States Forest Service, this region has always been a high-risk area for forest fires. In summer, the air is dry and hot, and lightning striking the centuries-old pine trees can ignite hellish flames in a matter of minutes. To prevent such disasters, a network of fire towers has been set up throughout the forest, solitary steel structures rising above the treetops. On one of these towers, number 12, 29-year-old Jeremy Farrell was on duty. Jeremy was no rookie. He had already worked 2 seasons and was considered a reliable and responsible employee. The job of a watchman does not require much physical strength. Still, it does require iron nerves and the ability to endure loneliness. You sit all day in a small glass cabin 100 feet above the ground, scanning the green sea of the forest. Your only companions are the radio and your own voice when you get on the line for your following report. Jeremy was happy with this life. He was a quiet, unassuming guy from a small town in Utah who valued peace and nature more than noisy company. His colleagues described him as a thorough man who never broke the rules and was always alert. June 18, 1982 was a typical day. The weather was clear and windless. Jeremy, as usual, checked in every 3 hours. At 9 in the evening, he made his last call. He reported to the dispatcher that everything was calm, visibility was excellent, and there were no signs of smoke. His voice sounded completely normal on the radio, without a hint of concern. The following report was scheduled for midnight. At midnight, tower number 12 was silent. The dispatcher, a man with many years of experience, did not think much of it at first. Communication in the mountains is a fickle thing. There could have been interference, or the transmitter on the tower could have failed. He called Jeremy several times, but only a steady hiss came from the speaker. It was a breach of protocol, but not yet a cause for panic. The dispatcher made a note in the log and decided to wait for the next scheduled communication session at 3 in the morning. At 3 in the morning, the airwaves were still silent. Now it was becoming a serious problem. 2 consecutive missed reports were not just an equipment malfunction, it was an emergency. The dispatcher immediately contacted the chief ranger of the district and reported the situation. It was decided to send a team to the tower at dawn. The road to the 12th tower was long and arduous, several hours along an old logging track, passable only by off-road vehicles. At dawn on June 19th, a pickup truck with 2 rangers pulled up to the base of the tower. From a distance, they could see that something was wrong with the tower. Usually a dim light burned at night on the site. The guards often left the lamp on. Now, however, the cabin was completely dark. The rangers climbed the metal ladder. The door to the cabin was not locked, only ajar. Inside, everything was almost in order. An open book lay on the table, next to a mug of cold coffee. On a small stove in the corner was a frying pan with the remains of dinner. The radio was on and working. Jeremy's bed was neatly made, and his personal belongings, wallet, and car keys were on the nightstand. The only things missing were Jeremy himself and his powerful flashlight, which he always took with him when he had to go downstairs after dark. The first thought was an accident. Perhaps Jeremy had gone out for some fresh air during the night, slipped, and fallen down the stairs. The rangers carefully searched the area around the base of the tower. Nothing. No broken branches, no signs of a fall. They began to comb the area, gradually expanding their search radius. The forest around them was dense, but the ground was soft enough after the recent rains to retain footprints. But there were no footprints. Not a single imprint of Jeremy's boots, which had a distinctive tread pattern. After about an hour of searching, one of the rangers noticed a strange spot about 150 yards north of the tower. It was a small clearing, and right in the center of it was a patch of bare ground. As they got closer, the rangers froze. Before them was a perfectly flat circle about 12 feet in diameter. The grass inside the circle had been burned to a crisp, turning to ash. But the strangest thing was that the fire had not spread any further. The edges of the circle were transparent, as if drawn with a compass. The ground outside the circle was completely untouched. There were no signs that a fire had been lit here. There were no traces of flammable liquids either, and in the very center of this scorched circle lay Jeremy's lantern. It lay flat, glass side up, and was turned off. The rangers stood frozen, not daring to approach. The situation was no longer just strange, it was becoming impossible. There was not a single trace around or inside the circle, no human or animal. It was as if the lantern had materialized out of thin air and fallen into the center of the ashes. Someone or something had placed it there without leaving any footprints on the rain-soaked ground. Soon, the county police and investigators arrived. The scene was cordoned off. Photographers recorded everything down to the smallest detail: the empty tower, the untouched belongings, the scorched circle, and the lone lantern. A full-scale investigation began. The investigators were baffled. The accident theory was ruled out immediately. Kidnapping. But why? Jeremy had no enemies and led a secluded life. There were no ransom demands. And most importantly, how could the kidnappers have created this strange circle and left the lantern without leaving any traces? When investigators began questioning the few local residents living within a few miles of the tower, another detail emerged. The owner of a small ranch located about 5 miles southwest of Tower Number 12 reported that on the night of the disappearance, about an hour before Jeremy was supposed to make contact at midnight, he heard a strange sound. He described it as a very low, vibrating hum, unlike the sound of an aeroplane or a running generator. According to him, the hum seemed to come from everywhere. It lasted about 10 to 15 minutes, before stopping just as suddenly. The man didn't think much of it at the time, attributing it to some forestry equipment. But now, in light of the caretaker's disappearance, this information took on a sinister tone. The official report on the disappearance of Jeremy Farrell ended with a dry statement. The cause of the disappearance is unknown. The whereabouts of the missing person are unknown. But what did not make it into the official papers was whispered among the rangers and police officers working at the scene. They talked about the impossibility of the scene, about the chilling sense of wrongness it evoked. They discussed an event that had occurred in the Kaibab forest that night, something they couldn't explain or put into words. The search for Jeremy continued for several weeks, but yielded no results. He was gone. All that remained was his flashlight in the center of a circle of ash. The large-scale search for Jeremy Farrell that followed yielded absolutely nothing. Hundreds of volunteers, rangers, and police combed the forest square by square. Search dogs were brought in, but the investigators were met with their first inexplicable incident. The dogs picked up Jeremy's scent from his personal belongings in the tower. They confidently led the way to the foot of the stairs, but then began to behave very strangely. They whined, cowered to the ground, and categorically refused to go toward the scorched circle. None of the dogs was able to pick up the trail leading from the tower into the forest. Jeremy Farrell's trail ended at the foot of his workplace, as if he had vanished into thin air. The circle in the clearing became the focus of the investigation. Forensic experts took samples of soil and ash. The results of laboratory analysis only added to the mystery. Experts determined that the grass had been exposed to extremely high temperatures, but only for a very short time. It did not resemble the effects of ordinary fire or combustible substances. No chemical residues were found in the soil. The nature of the damage indicated that the heat pulse had been directed strictly vertically, from top to bottom. It was as if a giant red-hot branding iron had been pressed against the ground for a split second. The physicists who were called in to consult on the case were at a loss. It would have been impossible to create such an effect without complex and cumbersome equipment. Jeremy's flashlight was also carefully examined. It was in perfect working order, with the batteries almost fully charged. There were no fingerprints on the body, except for Jeremy's smudged ones. But microscopic analysis revealed microparticles of the same ash from the circle in small cracks near the power button and on the body's threading. This meant that the flashlight had been at the center of the circle at the moment of the event, whatever it was. But how it survived without melting from such a high temperature was completely unclear. The official investigation reached a dead end after a few months. With no body, no suspects, and no clear explanation of what had happened, the case was suspended and sent to the archives. Jeremy Farrell was officially declared missing. The story of the strange disappearance on Tower Number 12 eventually became a local legend, told by rangers to newcomers to scare them on dark nights. The tower was decommissioned a few years later and slowly rusted away under the merciless Arizona sun, a monument to an unsolved mystery. Years passed. It seemed that the truth about what happened to Jeremy would never be revealed. But in 1996, 14 years after his disappearance, there was an unexpected turn of events. A group of geology students conducting field research in a remote area of the Kaibab Forest, about 15 miles northeast of the location of the abandoned tower, stumbled upon something strange. Hanging from an old juniper branch, about 10 feet above the ground, was a tattered piece of thick green fabric. It was the sleeve of a standard U.S. Forest Service jacket. Intrigued, the students began to examine the ground beneath the tree. Under a thick layer of fallen pine needles and soil, they felt something hard. It was a small, leather-bound field notebook, badly damaged by moisture and time. The find was handed over to the authorities. An expert examination confirmed that the notebook belonged to Jeremy Farrell. It was his personal diary, which he had apparently always carried with him in his jacket pocket. Most of the pages had stuck together and turned into a paper mess, but the last few entries, written in pencil, were legible. And these entries shed light on the previous days of Jeremy's life, turning a mysterious story into something truly terrifying. The last 3 entries were dated June 16th, 17th, and 18th, 1982. They were written in a concise, hurried handwriting that was very different from the calm, measured entries at the beginning of the diary. The entry from June 16th reads, "I've seen these lights for the 3rd night in a row. They're not satellites or airplanes. They move too chaotically, hover, then suddenly take off. And they are completely silent. They appear in the north, above the plateau. Probably some military tests, but here, so close to populated areas, strange. The animals are also behaving strangely. I haven't seen a single deer in 3 days." Entry from June 17th. "Today the forest is deathly silent. I can't even hear the birds. Something's wrong. There's tension in the air. All day long, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I went out to the clearing several times and scanned the forest with my binoculars. Nothing. But the feeling won't go away. It's not just loneliness. It's something else, something alien. And the last entry was made on the afternoon of June 18th, a few hours before his disappearance. The handwriting here becomes even more uneven, the words scribbled with firm pressure. Went down for water in the morning, found tracks by the stream on the damp ground. Never seen anything like it. 3 toes, very deep indentations, like a huge bird, but not a bird print. And the distance between the tracks, about 8 feet. I followed them. They led from the stream into the thicket. I walked 100 yards. The tracks just stopped in the open. They just ended. There were no signs of a struggle. No signs that the creature had flown away. The branches above the spot were intact. It just disappeared. I went back to the tower. I bolted the door, even though it's stupid. I'm 100 feet up. But I don't think it matters. I feel like I'm in a cage. There's something here, in this forest, and it knows I'm here. This last entry completely changed the picture of what had happened. Jeremy hadn't just encountered something inexplicable on the night of his disappearance. He knew there was something in the forest. He felt its presence, saw evidence of its existence. He was scared. The mysterious hum the farmer heard, the burned circle, the missing footprints. It was all starting to fit together into a single, terrifying mosaic. Jeremy Farrell was not a random victim. He did not sleep on his last night. He waited, and whatever came for him first left its mark by the stream, then left a burnt circle in the clearing as its only message. But what exactly happened between the last entry in the diary and the moment when his lantern found itself in the center of that circle? And what was this creature capable of leaving such traces and disappearing without a trace? The diary answered some questions, but it raised even more, and the most important of them was, what happened to Jeremy himself? Jeremy Farrell's diary was the last official piece of evidence in the case. It confirmed that the caretaker had encountered something unknown. Still, it couldn't answer the central question. What happened that night at the foot of the tower? Officially, the case remained unsolved. However, there is another document, a report that was never part of the main case file and spent decades in the county sheriff's archives, was labeled irrelevant. It was a report by a young deputy sheriff who, on the night of June 18, 1982, was patrolling the area adjacent to the National Forest. What he saw turned this story from a mystery into evidence of a nightmare. The deputy sheriff's name was Martinez. He had only recently joined the force. That night, around 11 p.m., he was sent to investigate a complaint from the same farmer who had heard the strange rumbling. Martinez thought it was a routine call, most likely some logging or geological equipment working in the woods. As he approached the area, he heard the sound himself. It was a low-frequency vibration that seemed to make the windows of his patrol car rattle. Radio communication began to fail, and only crackling and hissing could be heard from the speaker. Following the road that ran along the edge of the forest, Martinez noticed a strange glow above the treetops in the direction where he estimated Tower Number 12 to be located. It did not look like the glow of a fire. It was a pale, pulsating light. Deciding that there might be a fire on the tower, he turned onto a forest road leading deeper into the territory. As he got closer, the hum grew louder. After driving about a mile, he left the car and continued on foot, following the light. When he reached the edge of a clearing about 200 yards from the tower, he froze. The scene that met his eyes defied all logical explanation. In the clearing, in the very spot where a burnt circle would later be found, stood a creature. In his report, Martinez struggled to find the words to describe it. It was tall, at least 8 feet, and had humanoid features, 2 legs, 2 long, thin arms. But that was where the resemblance to a human ended. Its body was dark, almost black, and seemed to absorb light. It had no head in the usual sense. Instead, there was a smooth, rounded bulge, which was the source of the pulsating light and low hum. At the feet of this creature, on the ground, someone was lying. Martinez did not immediately realize that it was a human being. He was lying on his side, and a thin beam of light was darting around him on the ground. It was Jeremy Farrell, with his flashlight. He was alive. He was trying to crawl away. The creature stood over him completely motionless, seemingly just watching. Martinez, paralyzed with fear, stood in the shadows of the trees, unable to move or make a sound. He instinctively reached for his holster, but his fingers wouldn't obey him. Then the creature slowly raised one of its arms. It stretched toward Jeremy. At that moment, as Martinez wrote, the hum intensified sharply to a deafening roar, and the light emanating from the creature's head became unbearably bright. There was a sharp, dry crack, like the sound of static electricity, only amplified 1,000 times. For a split second, the clearing was flooded with blinding white light. Martinez closed his eyes, and when he opened them, it was over. There was no one in the clearing. No creature. No Jeremy. The rumbling stopped, and the light disappeared. In the deafening silence that followed, all that could be seen was a blackened patch of grass, smoking on the ground, in the center of the clearing. And on that patch lay a lone lantern, which had stopped casting its beam across the ground. Shocked, Martinez managed to get to his car and contact headquarters. His rambling story about a tall figure and a bright light was initially dismissed as nonsense. But when rangers found the empty tower and a perfectly burned circle with a lantern in the center at dawn, their attitude changed. Senior officers and men in plain clothes who did not identify themselves arrived at the scene. Martinez was questioned for several hours. He was politely but insistently told that he was most likely the victim of stress and the play of light and shadow, that he had seen a flash of lightning or the headlights of a car on the distant road. His initial report was confiscated. Instead, a brief report was filed stating that the deputy sheriff had arrived at the scene after the alleged incident and had found nothing of significance. He was strongly advised to forget what he thought he saw if he wanted to continue his career in law enforcement. Martinez followed the advice. He served in the police for many more years, but never told anyone about that night. Only after retiring, shortly before his death, did he share the story with his son, passing him the draft of his original accurate report. Thus, the story of Jeremy Farrell's disappearance is not just a case of a missing person. It is a story of encountering something that dwells in the wildest and most untouched corners of our world. A creature capable of taking people away without a trace, leaving behind only scorched earth. The official version remains the same. Jeremy Farrell got lost in the woods and died, and his body was never found. But the evidence, the diary, the scorched circle, and the young cop's report buried for decades, tells a very different story. A story about how Jeremy wasn't the only one on duty at Tower Number 12 that night. He was being watched by something ancient, alien, and utterly indifferent to human life, and at some point, it just decided to reach out.